Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on Chapter 5, Legality of Subject Matter and Contractual Capacity. You should see the chapter objectives popping up on this first slide. Chapter 5 is pretty short. It really covers two pretty straightforward areas in contract law: legality of subject matter and contractual capacity. So in our short PowerPoint here, we'll really just be introduced to those concepts and the major points, focusing on a couple distinctions we have to make. One being malleum in se versus malleum prohibitium. We'll spend a little bit of time on that. We'll discuss contractual capacity, and then we'll summarize everything at the end. There are 5 exercise problems at the end of this chapter. Those are always good to go over. The first question requires you to do some state-specific research into what our jurisdiction considers to be malleum in se and malleum prohibitium. Then there's a question that asks students to determine whether a person may be entitled to a remedy even if the contract is deemed to be malleum prohibitium. Next, I believe, question 3 and 4, they present an opportunity for you to discuss the facts that are external to a written contract and how those come into play. The final question is a fact scenario, and it asks you to argue for and against a particular proposition, and it highlights questions of legality and actually morality intertwined with statutory regulations in certain areas of life. So those would all be good questions to review for evaluation purposes, for test-taking purposes. There are 2 cases, like most of our chapters, with the exception of, I think, chapter 12 maybe. The first case is the First Colony Insurance Company case, and it involves a person's mental capacity with respect to his ability to change a life insurance beneficiary. And then the second case is the Achi Holdings LLC versus Silver Hill Financial Company, and it discusses usury. So be sure to do those 2 case briefs. All right, so with that introduction, going over the objectives, we'll discuss legality of the subject matter. We'll go over definitions for both malleum in se and malleum prohibitium. We'll list, there's a typo there, we'll list the 6 types of contracts. Not even my typo, I'm using the publisher PowerPoint today, so anyway. We'll discuss what's meant by usury and understand that different jurisdictions define usurious rates differently, and some of them have regular, easy to follow rates, while other jurisdictions have pretty complex usury statutes that are chained to indexes or are determined by the amount of the contract. I'm going to pause here for just 1 second. We'll discuss the contract capacity concept, differentiate between infants and minors, know what types of contracts a minor cannot avoid, discuss booze and drugs. I guess you'll have to twist my arm to get me to do that, and apply the concepts of legality and capacity to everyday life. So first of all, legality of subject matter. Not all regulations in society, not all laws involve these tremendous, outrageous crimes. We divide illegality into two broad categories. So within the first category of laws, we see things that support the very nature of our society that keep anarchy and chaos from ensuing. And violations of these rules go against all public policy and social norms. And contracts violating them are completely void and unenforceable. The second category involves what we could call minor illegalities. Those laws created by statute, that bar actions, which are not, crimes against humanity or against natural law. There are things that as a society, we've deemed them necessary, often because of economic considerations and equal protection, along with a slew of other reasons that contracts that violate the second category may still permit the injured party some form of quasi-contractual relief. So there's much more flexibility with the second area of legality of subject matter. So malleum in se, or contracts that are malleum in se, violate public policy and are prima facie bad. They are deemed to be against social norms and therefore will not be upheld under any circumstances. So a good example of that, a primary example of a contract that falls under such a category would be a contract for murder. So between a jilted lover and a hitman who wanted to pay someone to kill their ex-wife or their ex-husband. Malleum prohitium, contracts that are not morally reprehensible or against public policy, but are still violations in a minor sense, and prohibited usually by statute, case law, or maybe even local ordinance, state regulation. You pick your poison there. Now, one thing that we've mentioned a few times in class that finally comes up here in greater detail is the statute of frauds, which in and of itself is not a contract provision. It's not a law of general construction for contracts. Rather, it's a evidentiary rule. And it tells us that these 6 areas under the common law require the contracts to be in writing for them to be enforceable. So contracts dealing with property, and you see that is termed as for any interest in realty, meaning anything, a lease, a land sale, a regular conveyance of property has to be written down. Performance contracts that cannot be performed within 1 calendar year. So if you have an ongoing, a long-standing performance contract that will take more than 12 months, it must be in writing. The third is contracts in consideration of marriage. So any prenuptial or postnuptial agreement will need to be memorialized in writing. Anytime you sign on as a guarantor, that needs to be in writing. The sale of goods valued over $500, you got to be careful here, and depending on what state you're in, they may have a different monetary amount that triggers the statute of frauds for goods. And again, these statutes run from very straightforward and simple. So they may mirror the common law and just say $500. And it may have been lower years ago under the common law. Or they may depend on the type of good or have other subordinate clauses within the statute that trigger different requirements of that specific statute of frauds. And then under the common law, an executors, or as we call them in Florida, a personal representatives, promise to pay the decedent's debt, which we typically do not run into anymore in modern probate, but historically that was a concern, and those agreements needed to be evidenced in writing. Typically now what we say is any agreement, like a guarantee to pay the debt of a third party. All right, so usury laws. Usury laws regulate the legal rate of interest that can be charged for extending credit. A contract for the loan of money that indicates a rate of interest above the legal limit is melium prohibitium. And because it is usurious, it is therefore unenforceable. Again, this is very, very state specific. Florida's usury rate under statute is 18% on contract. There are different rates for judgments and different rates for, in a lot of states, secured versus unsecured loans. So something like a car or a boat where there's collateral would be different than just a line of credit. There are states with higher rates than Florida, but not too many. Florida has a very high rate as far as usury goes. I believe Texas, Rhode Island, where I'm heading off to later this week, and a few, maybe 3 or 4 other jurisdictions either match Florida or surpass it. But again, these laws, there can be exceptions. So one example in Florida is for loans over $500,000, the interest rate actually goes up. You can charge something almost ungodly, 25%, I believe it is, for loans over $500,000. For a typical installment loan in Florida, it's 18%, and anything over that would be unenforceable for a loan under $500,000. When we talk about capacity, we're talking about someone's ability legally to enter into a contract. There are 4 major areas of contractual capacity. Age, so we know that being under the age of majority can be an issue when entering into contracts. Mental capacity, and then alcohol and drugs. And when we think about drugs, we don't just think about illegal, illicit drugs, but we think about all of the pharmaceuticals and prescriptions that people have legally that may put them in a state where they lack capacity. We also bring in, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and understand that it presents problems. Again, going back to the foundational elements of how you build a contract, we need to have a meeting of the minds, an offer, an acceptance that builds mutual assent, and understand what the terms and conditions are, and lack of capacity in any one of these ways destroys that. Wow, that's the publisher had a short PowerPoint there. Let me actually go back in here and we can just talk about this real quick, since they didn't want to build any other slides, I guess, for these areas. So with age, we know that in the United States, the age of majority in every jurisdiction is 18 now. When it comes to contracts, you find different age of majority statutes for different areas of the law. But when we're talking specifically about contractual capacity, you're considered an adult when you're 18. What are the exceptions to when a child enters into a contract? Well, first of all, we know that on its face it's voidable. The minor who entered the contract, with a few exceptions, can void the contract. The main exception here is necessities under the common law, or necessaries, as you'll see it written in some places. So under the common law, when children engaged in contractual relationships for food, clothing, shelter, and in some jurisdictions, medical care, they would be contractually bound. Also remember ratification after they achieve the age of majority. In those situations, they will be contractually bound for post hoc adoption of the contract. Now, with mental capacity, some of this becomes very, very difficult and actually a matter for the fact finder in those gray areas where it's hard to determine whether contractual capacity exists because of mental issue or not. Sometimes there are clear-cut cases. So if someone lacks capacity and it's evidenced by a judicial and medical determination, someone's been adjudicated incompetent, then certainly they lack prima facie capacity and there will not be a contract. The problem is people can contract. It's sort of like drafting one's will during lucid intervals. So as long as you understand in the time frame that you were building the contract, that you entered into the contract, you agreed on whatever terms and conditions, whatever burdens were going to be put on you contractually, cost and obligations on your end, as long as you understood that, a lack of mental capacity going forward is not going to relieve you of capacity. So this goes, or from contractual liability rather, and the same thing goes for drugs and alcohol. So there are people who are functioning alcoholics or functioning drug addicts. Alcohol and drugs may destroy capacity, but not necessarily. If a person is in a lucid interval, or it can be proven that drugs or alcohol were in their system, but they still had capacity, then they're going to be bound by that contract. Only when you can show the alcohol abuse or drug abuse was at such a level that they did not know and did not have the intention of entering into a contract, will they be able to escape liability for entering into that contract. You can come up with all kinds of hypotheticals that really would need to go to a fact finder, would need to be litigated to be determined. So it's really behooves us to remember that entering into any type of contract with folks that might be minors, lack capacity, or who have drug or alcohol issues are problematic and just sort of a ticking time bomb when it comes to potential litigation. That kind of wraps it up for Chapter 5. When we get back together next week, which I guess will be the 15th of, the 15th of June, we will cover both of the cases from the beginning of our time together. We'll go over any questions you have dealing with legality and capacity. We can go through some examples or anything you had in the book before we move over. So I know this was sort of a brief introduction. I will get this uploaded along with your Chapter 5 assignment module stuff, and you can be working on that between now and next week. So thanks, and have a good one.